see our economy go back into a tailspin.
Jessica is in Diamond, Ohio, Republicans line. Good morning.
Yes, hello.
Senator Lieberman and Senator Graham from South Carolina.
Without objection, the senator from Arizona is recognized, and his request, without objection, is granted.
Mr. President, it's with a heavy heart that I rise today to speak about the horrific attack yesterday on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi that killed 4 American citizens. The 2 confirmed thus far to be among the dead are Sean Smith, an Air Force veteran turned State Department Information Management Officer, and Ambassador Chris Stevens, one of America's finest and bravest Foreign Service officers. I didn't know Sean Smith. I know he's a great American who served his country, but I'd gotten to know Chris Stevens quite well. And in Ambassador Chris Stevens' death, the Libyan people have lost a great champion and believer in the peaceful aspirations of their democratic revolution. The American people have lost a selfless and dedicated servant of our interests and our values. And I have lost a friend. My thoughts and prayers today are with Chris's family and the loved ones of his fallen colleagues. May God grant them comfort in their time of grief. Our most urgent order of business now is to make sure that our citizens still living and serving in Libya and Egypt and elsewhere across the region and the world are safe. Americans look to the government in Libya and Egypt and elsewhere to meet their responsibilities in this regard. We also look to the Libyan government to ensure that those responsible for yesterday's attack in Benghazi are swiftly brought to justice. In all of these critical tasks, we are confident that our government will provide all necessary assistance and support. Yesterday's attacks are an important reminder that so many of American civilians and diplomats and development professionals are risking everything to advance our nation's interests and values abroad. We must do everything in our power to ensure their security. At the same time, our thoughts turn to broader concerns, the mourning of our fallen friends, and how we as a nation should respond to these tragic events. One of my most memorable meetings with Chris Stevens was last April in Benghazi. As a U.S. envoy to the Libyan opposition, Chris had traveled to Benghazi at great personal risk to represent the country that he loved so much while Libya was still gripped in a brutal fight for freedom. It was clear there was nowhere that Chris would rather have been than Libya. We spent the day together meeting Libyan opposition leaders and many ordinary citizens who spoke movingly about how much the opportunity to finally live in freedom meant to them and how grateful they were for America's support. Chris Stevens embodied that support, and his passion for his mission was infectious. I kept in touch with him often and frequently after my visit. I was very happy when President Obama nominated him to be America's ambassador to the new Libya. The last time I saw Chris Stevens was shortly after he had taken up his post during my most recent visit to Tripoli. I especially remember the lighter moments we spent together, including when Chris insisted on personally making me a cappuccino, a task that he carried out with as much pride and proficiency as his diplomatic mission. That was on the morning of July 7th, the day Libyans voted in their first election in half a century. Chris Stevens and I spent the day together again, traveling around Tripoli, visiting polling places, and speaking with Libyan voters. We met a man whose father had been murdered by Gaddafi's henchmen. We met a woman whose brothers had recently given their lives fighting for their country's liberation. We met countless others, including many older Libyans who were voting for the first time in their lives. And everywhere we went, we were greeted by crowds of cheering Libyans, bursting with pride and eager to shake our hands and express their gratitude for America's support. It was one of the most moving experiences of my life, and it was only made better by the fact that I got to share it with our outstanding ambassador, Chris Stevens. What we saw together on that day was the real Libya, the peaceful desire of millions of people to live in freedom and democracy, the immense gratitude they felt for America's support for them, and their strong desire to build a new partnership between our nations. That's why I'm not surprised that senior Libyan leaders were among the first to condemn the horrific attack that killed Chris and his colleagues. And that's why I was not surprised to learn from our Secretary of State that many Libyans fought to defend our people and our consulate in Benghazi when they came under attack, that some were wounded while doing so, and that it was Libyans who sought to get Chris and his colleagues to the hospital. And that's why we can't afford to view the despicable acts of violence perpetrated yesterday by a small group of fanatics as in any way representative of the country and the people of Libya. That's not the real Libya, the Libya that Chris Stevens knew and learned to love so well. After such a heartbreaking loss for our nation, I know that many Americans are asking whether the United States was naive or mistaken to support the vast movement for change that is known as the Arab Spring. I know many Americans may feel a temptation, especially with so many domestic and economic challenges facing us here at home, to distance ourselves from people and events in Libya and Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East. We cannot afford to go down that path. Yesterday's attack in Benghazi was the work of a small group of violent extremists whose goals and actions could not be more at odds with those of the people and government of Libya. The Libyan revolution began peacefully and was dedicated throughout to the ideals of freedom, injustice, and democratic change. And when Libyans turned out by the millions to elect a new government in July, they gave the plurality of their vote not to religious fanatics, but to a political party led by a moderate technocrat and committed to friendship with the United States. Libyans rose up last year to free themselves from exactly the kinds of murderers and terrorists who killed our American citizens yesterday in Benghazi. Their enemies are our enemies, and they remain as committed as ever to imposing their evil ideology through violence on people in Libya and the Middle East, and ultimately on us. They want to hijack the Arab Spring for their own insidious purposes. And if we turn our backs now on the millions of people in Libya and Egypt and Syria and other countries across the Middle East, people who share so many of our values and interests, people who are the true authors of the Arab Spring, we will hand our common enemies, the terrorists and extremists, the very victory that they seek. We were right to take the side of the Libyan people and others in the region who share their peaceful aspirations, and we would be gravely mistaken to walk away from them now. To do so would only be a betrayal of everything that Chris Stevens and his colleagues believed in and ultimately gave their lives for. It would be a betrayal of America's highest values and our own enduring national interest in supporting people in the Middle East and the world who want to live in peace and freedom. Mr. President, I'm pleased to be joined by my friend from Connecticut, and I know that he shares with me the sorrow that we and all Americans feel at the loss of a brave and dedicated American. But it'll be a long time before we forget Chris Stevens, because he will stand as a shining example of patriotism and love of country. Chris Stevens was not unaware of the danger that he faced. He was privy to intelligence, information, and others. But he went forward and did his job with a smile, with love of his country and love of the country where he was serving. I cannot be more proud of Ambassador Chris Stevens.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I thank my friend from Arizona for his very eloquent statement. I associate myself with it. It strikes me as I listen that it was no accident that these violent extremists launched this attack on the American consulate in Benghazi, Tripoli on 9/11, on September 11th, a day of infamy in our history, a day when people across our country and really around the world were commemorating the worst terrorist attack in our history, which was September 11th, 2001. Those who perpetrated the attack on the consulate in Benghazi, which resulted in the death of our ambassador, Chris Stevens, carried out an act of terrorism and barbarism that they hope will sow fear and hatred between Americans and Muslims, just as Osama bin Laden and his followers hoped the attacks of 9/11/01 would do 11 years ago. But we did not let bin Laden succeed then, and we will not let these violent extremists who killed Chris Stevens yesterday in Benghazi succeed in dividing America and the West from Muslims and the Arab world. Good, well-intentioned people in both great communities will rise up and join together to renounce these extremists and killers. I want to speak for a moment about Ambassador Stevens. Simply put, Chris Stevens was one of the finest, bravest, most spirited, most talented diplomats in our nation's service. As a volunteer in the Peace Corps, he served in Morocco, where he was inspired to pursue a lifetime of service in the Middle East. When the uprising against Muammar Gaddafi began in February of last year, Chris was the Deputy Chief of Mission of our embassy in Tripoli, Libya. He was evacuated, along with other American personnel from the country, but returned to Libya within weeks as the special envoy of the United States of America to the opposition there, courageously slipping into rebel-held Benghazi on board a cargo freighter. It was an act of bravery that typified Chris Stevens' service to our country and his devotion to our nation's ideals and his commitment to build bridges between Americans and Arabs, Americans and Muslims. Chris remained in Benghazi throughout the war, standing with the people of Libya during some of the darkest and most difficult hours in their struggle for freedom. He became, in fact, the bright symbol of America, a heroic and inspiring figure to many Libyans, as Senator McCain, Senator Graham, and I heard during our visits there, and was thus the natural choice of President Obama to become our ambassador to Tripoli after the Gaddafi regime fell. This is also why his death at the hand of violent extremists in Benghazi, which was the seat of the revolution against Gaddafi, is so tragic and infuriating. There's obviously much we still don't know about what happened at our consulate in Benghazi yesterday, but what is clear is that these attackers have to be apprehended and must be punished. I'm encouraged but not surprised by the statements of Libya's leaders condemning this attack. And I say I'm not surprised because these statements of condemnation of those who killed Chris Stevens are consistent with what I know the leaders of the new Libya to be, what I know to be their profound admiration and love for Chris Stevens, and their respect and gratitude for the United States of America. We look now to the Libyan government to act swiftly and decisively, and to our own government to provide the Libyans whatever support they need to find the attackers and killers. While a specific group of individuals was responsible for this evil act, and their target immediately was the Americans in that consulate, but really their target was the new order in Libya. And they were animated in this by an ideology that is now all too familiar to us that we cannot ignore or excuse. This hateful and violent ideology is a threat not just to the lives of Americans like Chris Stevens and the 3 others who died yesterday in Benghazi, but to the future of Libya and the future of the Muslim world. It is the exact opposite of the ideals that inspired millions of Libyans to rise up last year against Gaddafi, to realize their dreams of a life of dignity, democracy, and human rights. For that reason, it is imperative now for those Libyan people themselves to echo their leaders and condemn this violence and take on the extremists who have taken shelter in their midst and who threaten to hijack their revolution and imperil the future of their country, returning them to days as dark as under Gaddafi. I know that the overwhelming majority of Libyans reject this violent extremist agenda. They want a good education for their children. They want foreign investment that will create jobs and raise their standard of living. After 42 years of despair and oppression under Gaddafi, they badly want again to be part of the world, part of the modern world. And the United States should stand ready and willing to help them on that path. The fact is that the people who killed Chris Stevens yesterday in Benghazi do not represent the people of Libya or their elected leadership. But these killings require confronting the extremist minority that imperils this future, the fanatics who want a clash of civilizations between Muslims and the West, and who will try to justify their violence in the name of Islam. They are wrong. They are mistaken. They are on the wrong side of history. And finally, let me come back home and say, to echo what Senator McCain has said, that I know there'll be some here in our country who, in the wake of this attack, will be tempted to argue that it shows that America's support for the Libyan revolution was naive or mistaken, that the Arab Spring will ultimately be defined not by a desire for democracy and freedom among the people of the Middle East and Arab world, but by the dark fanaticism of al-Qaeda and its associates. And the United States should give up trying to support people in this part of the world instead retrench back here at home. That would be terribly wrong. That would misunderstand the motivations of the people who have risen up in the Arab world to overthrow the totalitarian governments that dominated their lives. They don't want the fanaticism of al-Qaeda. They want the bright light of a democratic future. We cannot allow what happened yesterday to be a victory for the extremists and the terrorists, because to do so would be a betrayal of everything Ambassador Chris Stevens stood for, which is to say a betrayal of America's best ideals. Mr. President, I note the presence on the floor of the Senator from South Carolina, and I would yield to him at this time.
Thank you. Mr. President, I'll just speak very briefly.
The Senator from South Carolina.
There's not a whole lot to be added to the eloquent statements of my 2 friends, other than just to be here and let the family of Chris Stevens know that we saw in your loved one what you saw. A wonderful man who did great things with a life cut way too short. I don't think most Americans can ever appreciate the leadership that Chris provided in Libya and throughout the world at a time when we needed it the most. So America's lost one of her greatest diplomats. The Libyans have lost one of their best friends, and the family have lost their dear loved one. And the one thing I can say for sure, Senator Lieberman just mentioned it, don't compound this tragedy. The worst possible outcome is to take the death of this wonderful, noble man and use it as an excuse to withdraw from Libya and the region and turn it over to the thugs that killed him. Chris would not want that. It is not in our national security interest, and Republicans and Democrats do not want that. To the American people, war-weary and frustrated, I totally get it. But the Arab Spring, call it what you like, is a historic opportunity to change things in the Mideast, and it will not come without a fight. What we're trying to do in the Mideast and what the people in the Mideast are trying to do is have a better life for themselves. If you're a young person, you've been exposed to life outside of the corrupt country in which you live, and you see it can be better, and quite frankly, you're demanding it can be better. You're demanding a better say if you're a young woman. You're demanding economic opportunity if you come from a certain class not available to you today. And Chris Stevens risked his life because he understood those demands were just in our best interest. And the people that we're fighting and the people the Libyan people are fighting are the ones who have no interest in this agenda of being able to choose a better path for young women, to be able to be tolerant, open, accept free markets, and to have a place where people can live their own dreams. In the world of which we're fighting, your dreams are defined by the Ayatollahs. Your aspirations are defined by someone else's view of where you should go and what you should be based on their interpretation of God's plan for you. Now, that, to me, is so unacceptable that it compels people like Chris Stevens to risk their lives, and that's what's at stake. The good news, we'll beat these folks. The ace in the hole is that the people in Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Afghanistan, Iraq now have been exposed to a different way of life. Given the capacity, they have the will to fight back. But if you think this is going to be done without a struggle, we're kidding ourselves. Chris knew that. He knew that the fight that was going on for the heart and soul of the Arab Spring in Libya was a fight worth engaging in and, yes, risking one's life for. And what more can you say about a fellow human being, an American, than the fact that they realized that their time on earth could be best spent in service of a cause, as Senator McCain says, greater than themselves. Chris understood what was at stake. He went to a place that he did not have to go. He accepted risks that he could have avoided, and he did it for all the right reasons. And the one thing we should all unite around is that what compelled Chris Stevens to risk his life is absolutely in our national security interest, and that is to get the Mideast right, have a second opportunity never known before in the Mideast, to live in peace with people who in the past wanted to kill us all. And I am convinced if we stick with it and we learn the lessons of Chris Stevens' life, we will eventually prevail. Because the ones who want to kill us all are really a minority. The ones who would live with us in peace if they could just need our help. And let it be said that Chris Stevens was there to help. Thank you.
I thank my friend for his eloquent words. I'd also, again, like to emphasize there was 4 brave Americans. 4. Sean Smith was one of them, a truly great American. There are 2 others, we don't even know their identity. So I hope that the families who have suffered this loss appreciate that we grieve for all. We had the opportunity of knowing Chris Stevens. I did meet Sean Smith and the others. We mourn for them, and we thank them for their service to this nation. And I just asked my friend from Connecticut, wouldn't it be the worst legacy of Chris Stevens' service to this country would be a movement for the United States to withdraw to Fortress America, to renounce our service to the world in helping these countries achieve the same democracy and freedom that our forefathers strive for. I do not mean to use his death as any kind of political agenda, but I think my friend and I remember him well enough to know that the worst outcome of this tragedy would be for the United States to withdraw. In fact, I am confident that if he were here, he would be urging us to get right back in, bring these extremists to justice, and press on with the democracy and freedom that the people of Libya deserve and have earned at great loss of blood and treasure.
Mr. President, I couldn't agree more with my friend from Arizona. It would really dishonor the service of Chris Stevens and the 3 other Americans who served us in Libya if their murders by these extremists led us to retrench and pull out of Libya and stop supporting the new Libyan government, democratically elected, pull out of other parts of the Arab world. That would be exactly the opposite of what Ambassador Stevens devoted his life to. As I mentioned, inspired by his experience as a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco, devoted the rest of his life to service on America's behalf in the Middle East. The last thing he would want this murder to do is to lead us to pull out, leave the area. And it would also be the fondest hope of the attackers, the extremists. Why do they attack? They attack to kill individual people, but they really attack to, as I said before, push America out and create a war between the Western world, America, and Islam. It's not natural. It's not the direction in which history is going. History is going much more toward integration. In fact, the revolution in Libya, which has gone so successfully when you consider the 40 years of dictatorship they lived under, they've held a free election. They elected what I would describe as a moderate rule of law slate to run the country. But those uprisings in Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, and now in Syria are the most profound rejection and defeat for the extremism of al-Qaeda and its allies, and presumably this group that attacked the American consulate in Benghazi yesterday. I understand that the results of some of the first elections are unclear, in some sense unsettled some people here, but the fact is they've chosen democracy, and people are self-governing, and they're looking for a better life, and that's exactly the opposite of what bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and I would guess the people who killed Chris Stevens yesterday desire. So Senator McCain is absolutely right. This is the day, you know, I can almost hear Chris Stevens saying, come on, get up, stay in the fight, don't surrender to the crazies, to the fanatics, to the violent extremists. Stand with the overwhelming majority, with the people of Libya who want just what we want, a better future for themselves and their families.
I'd just like to say in conclusion, I thank my old dear friend from Connecticut and the senator from South Carolina, and I finally would just share with my colleagues on last July 7th, I was in Tripoli with Chris Stevens, and it was the first free and fair election the Libyan people ever experienced. As we went from polling place to polling place, we met people who had lost brothers, husbands, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, at the hands of one of the more brutal butchers that has ever been on earth, Muammar Gaddafi. That night, we went to the square where there were some 200,000 people driving around, honking horns, celebrating waving Libyan flags, an auspicious start. And as Senator Lieberman pointed out, it was a moderate group who were elected to govern Libya by the people of Libya. And Chris Stevens was recognized by all of them. They knew Chris Stevens, and they knew what he represented, the United States of America. So those are memories that I will never forget, and I hope that his family will appreciate the magnificent service that Chris Stevens provided to this nation. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Mr. President, if I may just,
Senator from Connecticut.
before we do that, I'd ask unanimous consent for Robert Morris, who's an intern in the office of the occupant of the chair, the Senator from Oregon, to have privileges of the floor for the balance of the day.
Without objection.
And I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Sure.
President. The Senator from West Virginia.
I ask unanimous consent that the order of the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Mr. President, before I say what I originally came down here to say, I want to join my colleagues in condemning the senseless, horrible attack at the U.S. consulate in Libya and pay tribute to the 4 Americans, including our ambassador there, Chris Stevens, who were killed. I think all of us hope that the killers will be brought to justice quickly, and I suspect that will be the case. Our country has lost 4 true public servants in the part of public service which is the least known and sometimes the most important. It's a high calling, public service in general, but especially in dangerous places around the world. Ambassador Stevens was a serious, dedicated, and highly experienced diplomat with tremendous depth of expertise in Libya and the region. He and his colleagues spent their lives working on behalf of the United States of America. And I hope that their proud families and the entire diplomatic corps know that we are deeply grateful as a people. This cowardly attack is a setback, but it will not stop us from our mission of promoting freedom and democracy for the people of Libya, and it should not. It will not keep our diplomats from their important work overseas. I remember when I was a student in Japan, the ambassador there at the time, back in the late 50s, was a fellow named Dr. Edwin Reischauer, who was probably at that time the preeminent Japanologist in America. And he was a gentle, wonderful, marvelous person who the Japanese loved. And he was stabbed in one of those things that happens. It can happen on American streets, but it can happen on the streets of other countries, even with security. Some mad person got in and slayed him in a traditional Japanese manner with a Japanese sword. It was a horrible event, but it enlarged his legend. There was no bitterness from his family or his wife, and it didn't set anything back. The person was brought to justice. Now, Mr. President, I would like to speak also about other ways that we must join together to help those who serve our country, and that is in the creating of job opportunities for our unemployed veterans. We have many veterans, and many of them are unemployed or homeless. I talk about the Veterans Job Corps Act. This is a responsible investment, and we should do it promptly. Standing up for our veterans has been one of the top priorities since I began public service. Can't help but be that way if you live in West Virginia. I suspect it's true in Oregon, lots of places all over the country. By definition, it's true. But it's always personal, and the sentiments never wane. Before I was a senator, the person who held my seat for a long time was Senator Jennings Randolph. And I took his place on the Veterans Committee, and I've been on it now for 28 years. And it's a glorious committee, brilliantly led now by Patty Murray. And I was chairman once myself, perhaps not quite so brilliantly. So many brave service members, men and women, have fought to defend our way of life. People say that, and it's true. And they protect us every day. After such courageous and selfless actions, the least that we can do is make sure that when they return home they get good jobs, because they deserve those good jobs. They deserve jobs, and they deserve good jobs. They can be different. Military experience builds leadership and dedication and bravery and teamwork. And these traits are learned from working on the front lines. Not everything in the military happens on the front lines, but I just happen to be talking about that particular aspect of it in my short remarks here. No experience could prepare these workers better for the jobs that they hope to do after they leave the military service. I have a nephew who has just come back from Afghanistan, and he may be 23, he may be 24, maybe he's 25, but he's almost unreachable in his strength and his patriotism and what has happened to him as a human being, internally, intellectually, and in broad vision. He's grown so large and so great. Now, he has a job, so I'm not talking about him. But when you have so many brave service members, men and women, who do this, we need to pay attention to them when they come home. Political rhetoric and partisanship have no business in delaying efforts to help our veterans. Everybody loves to talk about veterans, and actually a lot of bills do pass, but not as many as should. They did not delay or decline when we called them for deployment, so we should not delay now. It's tragic that the unemployment rate for younger returning veterans is so much higher than the national unemployment rate. In 2011, the unemployment rate for young male veterans was over 29%, which is more than 11% higher than non-veterans of precisely the same age. It's heartbreaking that those who bravely served face unemployment or homelessness. This bill will not solve all problems, but it'll solve a bunch of them. West Virginians understand the importance of military service. With nearly 170,000 West Virginia veterans, we need to be sure that they have our full support, getting a job, getting health care, getting their pensions. These words come out of one's mouth easily. Getting the job done is harder. But the Veterans Job Corps Act invests in our veterans and in our communities. Veterans would have a new opportunity to serve and protect America by gaining priority placement in first responder positions, like police officers and firefighters. That makes sense, doesn't it? And emergency medical technicians. Our veterans have the experience to do these jobs. They have the instinct to do these jobs. They did it while they served. And our communities need their help. I don't know what's going to happen to the budget, but it's not going to be rosy and happy. And we need to have all those jobs which help protect us and keep us safe in play for our veterans and for others too. It would create conservation and resource management jobs for veterans, enlisting them in efforts to rebuild America through restoration of our forests, parks, coasts, and public lands. I think the presiding officer would agree that that's important. The Veterans Job Corps Act would establish a pilot program to provide veterans with access to the Internet and computers to assist in job searches, and would offer the military's Transition Assistance Program to eligible veterans and their spouses, too, at sites outside military installations in order to make it easier to relocate in pursuit of job opportunities. The legislation would also provide veterans in rural areas like West Virginia and Oregon with greater access to career specialists to help them write resumes and prepare for interviews, basic things, and therefore to find jobs. The programs in the Veterans Job Corps Act are supported by a fully paid-for $1 billion investment in our veterans' futures. It's a responsible effort to support our veterans and provide help for communities across America. In closing, I would like to especially thank Leader Reid and Chairman Murray for working with me to protect West Virginia jobs as part of this bill. The Veterans Job Corps Act is an important investment in our nation's veterans and our economy, and I hope that we can quickly move this bill through the Congress. I thank the Chair, and I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Kaka. that the quorum call be lifted.
Ordered.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I want to first join with the many senators today who have strongly condemned